On Earth Day this year, Michael Moore and Jeff Gibbs released a new movie entitled Planet of the Humans. The film immediately drew criticism for its thesis that renewable energy technologies are actually not eco-friendly, but are in fact dependent upon fossil fuels. The filmmakers imply that the environmental movement itself appears to have been co-opted by corporate interests. They conclude that technology cannot save us from the true threat, our own overconsumption and unchecked population growth. As someone who's spent a lifetime working in the world of manufacturing and supply chain, including high environmental impact technologies like automotive and aerospace on the one hand and clean technologies such as renewable energy on the other, I have a first-hand perspective of the issues this film should have addressed, but didn't. In this video, I'm going to outline the film I believe Michael Moore could have produced instead of this one. I should say up front that if you don't believe our climate is changing, or that this change is caused by human activity, or that it poses a threat to life on our planet, then this video probably isn't for you. To briefly recap the film, many believe its main flaw is its use of footage and ideas from more than 10 years ago. In clean technology time, a decade is an eternity, and indeed much has changed. The filmmakers make no attempt to consider the remarkable progress, both in terms of technology and sustainable practices, that has taken place since they began their project. Instead, they choose to present their footage and storyline as contemporary, omitting any reference to the time frames in which the footage was captured. As a result, the film takes on the feel of deceptive propaganda and false narrative that one would expect from the fossil fuel industry itself. In the end, the film offers no solutions and seems to wallow in its own despair. Anti-environmentalists found vindication in the film's portrayal of renewable energy, while soundly rejecting any idea that our predominantly growth-based economic system should be re-examined, which they suggest is the film's underlying eco-fascist message. Members of the environmental movement have uniformly condemned the film's premise and misleading content, with some calling for its retraction and demanding apologies from the filmmakers. In the midst of this crossfire, the filmmakers themselves appear to be somewhat dismayed by the response and what they view as attempts to censor the film. They have stated they see no reason to retract or correct any part of the film, and they point to the film's viral debut as evidence of its relevance and importance. In a recent interview with Michael Moore, I was struck by a single question he asked of his detractors in the environmental movement, which is this: if we believe we're on the right path, then why aren't we winning this battle? Indeed, the data portrays a stark reality, that emissions growth and environmental degradation have marched on unabated, despite advances in clean technologies and progress in the environmental movement. The examination of this paradox represents a missed opportunity for Michael Moore and his colleagues. Rather than explore the essential questions of our present reality, they pursued a narrative that had long since passed its expiration date. I believe that perhaps a more constructive and essential narrative is to acknowledge the good in what we've achieved over the past 10 years, but so too acknowledge the reality that it clearly hasn't been enough to slow emissions growth, driving the bad environmental effects long predicted by our scientists, and that we must now face and address the ugly truths that underlie our present approach in order to make the course corrections necessary to guide our efforts over the coming decade. The filmmakers argue that the issues presented in their film remain unchanged after 10 years. Here are 10 good reasons why that's not true. On a price-performance basis, wind and solar technologies are now the best economic choice for energy generation, even without government subsidies. And a new generation of battery technologies is fundamentally rewriting the script on the need for fossil fuels as a grid stabilization mechanism. These powerful new batteries have so radically altered the economics of electric transport that fossil fuel-based vehicles will become obsolete much sooner than people think. Methodologies such as rewilding, reforestation, permaculture, and regenerative agriculture are becoming increasingly more widely adopted, giving rise to more sustainable land use practices. The persistent efforts of environmental organizations, the scientific community, and a new generation of activists have resulted in a substantial rise in environmental awareness among consumers, and these consumers are exercising their power of choice, driving increasing demand for eco-friendly products and services. This rise in awareness is also impacting how skilled job candidates evaluate prospective employers, and many employees are demanding their companies adopt sustainable practices, and in a growing number of cases, pressing their employers to stop dealing with the fossil fuel industry. A rapidly expanding community of environmentally conscious investors has driven the development of sophisticated sustainability analytics tools and scoring models in the financial and investment industry. These tools are used to assess the sustainability of companies across virtually all industry sectors, and to create new indices and investment products that focus on sustainable businesses. And a growing number of large investment firms are announcing plans to divest from the fossil fuel industry itself. Public and private procurement organizations are adopting policies that focus buying power on sustainable products and materials. And many large corporations, such as Walmart, have begun to mandate that their suppliers track and publicly report their performance against sustainability targets. As you might suspect, corporations are paying attention to this rapid shift in demand for sustainable practices, products, and services. Over the past 10 years, companies have aggressively implemented environment and social governance policies, sustainability reporting initiatives, as well as their participation in local, regional, and international sustainability programs, all driven by an increasing awareness among stakeholders they could not survive without: consumers, employees, and investors. The push for sustainable transformation in government and industry is facilitated by a host of NGOs providing standards, guidelines, and databases for reporting sustainability metrics and managing environmental footprint reduction projects. New economic models are being adopted that fundamentally change how modern value chains operate. Frameworks like the circular economy seek to eliminate waste and continual consumption of resources by changing the way companies design and produce goods, how those goods are used, and what happens at the end of their useful lives, including recycling, reuse, material recovery, and remanufacturing. And finally, large-scale change requires policy roadmaps that facilitate coherent implementation of sustainable transformation. Policy initiatives such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Green New Deal have begun to define how to effect change on a massive scale. So, with all of this progress, we should expect to see a measurable slowing of carbon emissions and environmental degradation. Sadly, this hasn't happened. Somehow, after 25 years of UN conferences, clean technology innovation, corporate reporting, and everything else, the data suggests we seem to be getting nowhere. Emissions and atmospheric CO2 concentrations have increased steadily year after year. Not surprisingly, the data also shows corresponding increases in the production and consumption of fossil fuels globally. The resulting atmospheric warming is causing a cascade of climate feedback loops that are producing rising sea levels and more frequent and intense storms, floods, wildfires, and droughts, together with a massive extinction of species all over the world. And these effects appear to be accelerating. There is no longer a need for others to convince us that all of this is happening. Most of us can see it for ourselves. So how is this possible given everything that we're doing? While it's true our individual choices hold great power over corporations, they in turn understand very well that our perception is easily manipulated by cleverly crafted narratives. Most of us are familiar with the term greenwashing, which can be defined as making unsubstantiated or misleading claims about the eco-friendly characteristics of a company's practices, products, or services. Well-known examples include green product packaging by consumer goods companies, the promotion of renewable energy programs while quietly lobbying against environmental protection laws in the oil and gas industry, and banks touting investments in clean energy programs while providing hundreds of billions of dollars in financing to the fossil fuel industry. Yet these examples represent only the tip of the iceberg. There is a more pervasive and subtle form of deception that has taken root within virtually all major industry sectors, and with a far greater combined impact. It's driven by a fundamental economic reality. Achieving full-spectrum sustainability is difficult and enormously costly. Corporations, particularly publicly traded ones, are subject to relentless pressure to achieve profitability and growth mandates. Engaging in true sustainable transformation would force corporations to drastically reduce earnings, something that investors still value above all else. Regardless of their personal values, the formal fiduciary responsibility of corporate directors and executives is sound financial management and governance. There is no corresponding formal responsibility for environmental and social governance. It's far easier and less costly to create fictional narratives of holistic transformation by investing in smaller, incremental sustainability initiatives. In essence, corporations cloak themselves in the appearance of action to appease market demands for environmental stewardship while avoiding negative impacts to their bottom-line profitability and growth objectives. How is this done? The most widely used international sustainability accounting standards are indeed quite rigorous. However, public disclosure of the data is entirely voluntary, and the level of transparency is up to each company, allowing complete control over the narrative. These reports are essentially marketing brochures. There is no standard framework for presenting consistent, comparable, and relevant metrics that would enable the public and investment community to easily grasp the true picture of sustainable transformation within the business. And while governments and corporations are encouraged to set sustainability goals, there is no requirement to establish targets that comprehend the gravity of the threat and the limited time in which we have to achieve meaningful impact. So companies can set their goals far out into the future beyond the critical thresholds established by the latest IPCC projections. In the end, failing to perform against self-prescribed targets and goals carries no real consequences for these companies. So corporations are able to manage brand perception with environmentally conscious stakeholders by sponsoring and participating in international forums, funding environmental organizations, and publishing large glossy annual sustainability reports, without having to undertake real transformation. Essentially, corporations are judged and rewarded based upon the extent of their participation and sponsorship of environmental programs, rather than truly meaningful achievements in terms of sustainability. The strategy has proven not only economically viable, but highly effective. The Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst produces the Toxic 100 and Greenhouse Gas 100 indexes comprised of companies that are the worst environmental offenders. More than 30 companies on this combined index also appear on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. Stepping back now, we can ask ourselves what can be done to alter our present trajectory. I believe there are three main avenues of action we can and should take. In many ways, these are already underway but need to be given far greater focus and resources. First, the responsible economic, lifestyle, and political choices available to us as individuals do have a significant impact on consumption. How we choose to spend and invest our money wields incredible power with corporations. Consumer sentiment has been the single most important driver of public and private sector action on climate and sustainability over the past 10 years. As our awareness continues to expand and we become more resilient to manipulation relative to our choices, the environmental stewardship mandate for corporations and governments will continue to grow. Second, it seems intuitive that we cannot expand indefinitely into a space of finite capacity. Studies of natural species clearly show us there are limits to population growth, and while our fossil fuel-driven industrial revolution extended those limits for humans, we know that, ultimately, we are not exempt from them. The failure of Planet of the Humans to present a solution has caused much speculation about underlying messages of depopulation and degrowth. But the solution to this problem does not require draconian population reduction policies. The data clearly shows that the single most important modulator of birth rate and population growth is the education and empowerment of women. The correlation is a simple and immutable fact. It only remains to be more fully embraced and implemented, particularly in developing nations. And finally, as Greta stated in her now famous speech at the World Economic Forum in 2019, There is really no lack of solutions to the threat we face. There is only a lack of political will. Since governments tend to view their own prosperity as tied to the prosperity of industrial interests in international trade, it appears that it is the corporations that must lead the push for transformation. But what incentives would they have to do so? Well, simply stated, it's profitable. Sustainable technologies and practices, once implemented, are far more material and cost-efficient than the existing legacy approaches. It is the upfront capital costs and near-term earnings impacts associated with accelerated and scaled industrial transformation that have been prohibitive thus far. Many have pointed to the Green New Deal as the template for the large-scale FDR-like mobilization of labor, skills, and resources that is likely needed to pull off such an enormous transformation. But if we must assume a major overhaul of our present capitalist system is not politically viable in the near term, then corporations and governments must work synergistically to implement the required infrastructure changes. To do so, governments will need to facilitate the transition with financial incentives redirecting fossil fuel subsidies of nearly $500 billion annually, expanding investment tax credit programs, and funding public works projects to upgrade and modernize infrastructure. Finally, support will also be needed from the investment community to accommodate the earnings impacts that would likely come from multi-year corporate investments in sustainable transformation. For more than 3 decades, Michael Moore has shown courage in confronting highly polarized issues, asking uncomfortable questions that challenge our assumptions, and illuminating the dark underbellies of government and corporate institutions. And despite the perceived flaws of Planet of the Humans, it is its imperfections that have caused us to reflect on how far the environmental movement has come in the past decade, and has provided an opportunity to pause to consider the path that still lies before us. Some claim that the film's misleading message has done more harm than good, but I see the timing of the film as significant, not because it came on Earth Day, but that it was dropped in the middle of a global pandemic. The film has enabled many to refocus on the environmental crisis we are facing. At the same time, we're demonstrating the capacity to take swift global action to contain a virus that presents a very real threat to our existence. In this moment, a window of consciousness has opened within us to consider the possibility that such threats really do exist, and that we can do something about them. And some may argue that because climate change progresses at a much slower rate than a pandemic, it is more difficult for many of us to perceive as something that requires immediate action. This may have been true up to this point. However, our collective mindset has been fundamentally altered by this pandemic in such a way that we may now be capable of finding the resolve to undertake the great changes needed in this decade to ensure a habitable world for future generations. Hi, this is Stan. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. And if you'd like to see more of my videos, be sure to click the subscribe button before you go. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.